All right. Hello out there. Welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. I'm Dotsie Bausch alongside Alexandra Paul, or across from Alexandra Paul.
Hi, Dotsie.
And I'm just going to go ahead and not do the full intro. But yes, we have a guest in studio today, my dear friend, Dr. Angie Sadeghi. Thanks for coming in.
My absolute pleasure. Anytime.
Oh, good. So we have the most extraordinary guest on, in yours, in my opinion, right?
Well, she was our third guest on this show, and her first appearance on our show was so popular. People are so interested in this subject.
Right, one of the most downloaded of all time on our podcast, which you don't know, but that's true. So so she's back, and so much of what we learn from our guest is applied by you. I am kind of a creature of habit, do the same thing over and over again. But you take in the information, and you and I were talking a couple of days ago, and you told me that you are not appropriately cleaning yourself anymore. You're not using deodorant, and you're not using soap.
And I'm taking cold showers.
And you're taking cold showers. I knew there was a third thing.
It's my hygiene. We're going to talk about my hygiene.
Yes, because I'm concerned, and I know that some of it is because of your microbiome. Some of it is because of your metabolism with the cold showers.
And the fact that,
the doc's here, so I'm going to shut up. You tell her what you're doing and if this is safe.
So I am taking the cold showers for two reasons. One, we had several people on talking about the benefits of taking a cold shower to get more brown fat, which increases your metabolism. And also because my shower head actually doesn't get hot water. So I thought, so Ian and I were sharing a shower head, which was great because we like to shower together, which was great. But sometimes, but the problem is in our house, it takes 2 minutes for the shower to get hot. It's so irritating how the pipes were made. Oh, it's just winds around the entire place and then gets to our shower. So that's very wasteful of water, even though we have a bucket in there. So I thought, well, gee, I'll just use my shower head, which I haven't used in 6 months, and it'll be cold water. And it's great because it'll have a benefit, my health, and the planet won't be wasting as much water. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is Dr. Angie's philosophies that she's taught us has really had an effect on me. And in this time of COVID, we're all so obsessed with antibacterial wipes and soaps. And even when I was a kid, we used bar soap. Then came in the liquid soap, which I never liked because it had triclosan in it. I think is that how you pronounce it? Triclosan?
I don't even know, to be honest with you.
That's a chemical, which is not good for you. And of course, they come in plastic. So I always liked the bar soap. And I never liked the antibacterial soap because what I've learned from you is that our bacteria is good. And then, so I never washed my face with soap ever. And I always just went whoop with water,
right?
A single thing, and that was it. And then
I would be covered in blackheads. I just want to say.
Well, I don't wear foundation, and but
still, it's like so much pollution and dirt in the air.
I know, but I guess in the morning I would take a shower. So I basically, my face would get water once a day. Seemed to work okay.
Yeah, you're gorgeous, so obviously, yes.
I know if I looked like that too, I would use foundation.
Start rinsing my face.
Then I read this article in the New Yorker about how we need the bacteria in our skin it's good for us. And so I thought, well, you know what? My skin's getting really dry. I use soap when I shave, for example, my legs, and it's getting really dry. So I stopped, and it really improved my skin in terms of being dry. And I washed my hands because of COVID. I have to say that during the entire time of COVID, it's been 6 months, I've only used 4 antibacterial wipes. And that is when I snuck into our gym and used some weights. And then I felt like I really had to antibacterialize them because I was sneaking into the gym and using weights.
Wait, you snuck into the gym? Like it was closed?
We have a little gym on the property of our complex. And yes, I did. I snuck in. Took the weights out, brought them to my house, used them, brought them back, and then wiped them off with That's
very nice of you.
Antibacterial. Well, most of the reason I didn't use antibacterial stuff is because I couldn't get it. So I had 1 pack of these Clorox wipes, which I still have 12 of them left. But I have used, 3, I think.
Okay, so the typical European shower, which I will take somewhat often, is, the pits and the parts, which is like, those are going to get real stinky on me if I'm not using something other than water. How are you doing in that area? Like, you're
not supposed to use soap on your vagina.
Okay. But I'm saying that it's not an option for me because I enjoy being with my husband and he enjoys being with me, and we got to keep it good down there. So it's just like, it just smells fantastic. Everything smells good.
Yes, Ian has not complained.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I'm not using soap for the most part. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you don't stink. I mean, we're pretty close to you right now.
No, but I'm washing. Weird. I'm taking a shower every day.
But with water.
With water, and then when I shave, I use this a bar of conditioner. Actually, it's hair conditioner that comes in a bar form, and I just use it to shave my legs and my arms.
No chemicals in that?
It's pretty sustainable. It's pretty natural. It might have some, but yeah.
Okay.
And then I ditched the deodorant because now this has only been a week because of the aluminum in deodorant. I never used an antiperspirant because of that, the aluminum. But then I ditched the deodorant. That's a sort of I'm watching and waiting. I was using a salt stick, and then I realized it had aluminum in it still.
All right. So as it relates to our microbiome, because it's one of the main reasons, Ange, what is this?
Yeah. Tell me what you think in terms of my
She's
skin
weird
hygiene.
as I know she is.
Well, okay, so I'm not a dermatologist. However, intuitively, the more natural we could be, the better. And of course, with COVID, we're washing our hands often. And when I'm at the hospital, I don't want to carry infection from one room to another. But that's just the hands, right? The rest of the body doesn't have to be exposed to all these chemicals all the time,
How do you think our skin is? What is it when we wash soap on our skin every day and take off that microbiome?
Yes, I mean, harsh soaps, and you're killing the microbiome. I suppose that you're not supposed to use harsh chemicals to get rid of the healthy biome on your skin, just like you wouldn't want to do that with your gut.
Because our skin is our second largest organ, because I learned from you, microbiome is our largest organ, right?
Yes,
there's over 1 trillion of these little buggers.
100 trillion gut microbiome.
100 trillion. 100 trillion.
And they carry 100 times more genetics than our own eukaryotic cells. So there's more genetics involved in these little bugs than our own cells.
Wow. Now, how are the antibacterial wipes affecting? Have you seen a change in the gut microbiome because of all the antibacterial wipes that everyone is using these days?
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, to isolate that, just because of the hand washing, our microbiome is not as diverse. But, we're supposed to live somewhat dirty. And what I mean by that is we're supposed to be one with our environment. Of course, the problem is that we have zoonotic diseases such as COVID. We have other bacterial diseases. We have viruses like the flu. And so we're kind of forced into washing our hands all the time because of these pathogenic bacteria that will kill us. So it's a balance, right? I try to live dirty in a way where if I go into the backyard and I pick a fruit off the tree, I won't wash it because I know it's organic. I know it hasn't been sprayed. I would just eat it just like that, like berries or lemons. I don't wash those things. I just eat just like that. Of course, if you're going to the grocery store and you don't know where that produce came from, I think you should wash things. The other thing is when I'm around people and I'm at the hospital, I will wash because it's just I feel responsible not to carry infections from room to room. But I try to live dirty when I can. It has to be a balance.
That's amazing.
I mean, let's face it, this is not a diatribe against soap, and soap has really helped us stay healthy. But yeah, it's mostly, we'll see.
I like the
continue to
approach.
wash my hands, and maybe I'll wash my private parts if Ian complains.
But I think that's a really good meter for whether deciding whether you should wash them or not. So most of our listeners and everyone on the planet knows Dr. Angie, should know Dr. Angie.
Everyone on the planet.
Everyone on the planet. Everyone on the planet.
I love you.
Because you're by far our favorite gastroenterologist. I mean, that's a little bizarre to probably have a favorite.
She is my gastroenterologist.
She is yours. We have a favorite, maybe manicurist or facialist, but we also have a favorite gastroenterologist. So longtime listeners of the show know that we're somewhat obsessed with gut health, given our former conversation we just had too. So it's a real pleasure to have you on again. And there's so much to cover. I highly recommend everybody go back to episode 3, get the full story of your history, which I just want to touch on. And then we're going to dive into some new research and especially into your newly formed Institute of Plant-Based Medicine, which is wildly exciting because the world has access to it because of telemedicine.
Yes.
So we're going to go into that and the doctors and the dietitians that you brought in and the work that you guys are doing. So thanks for coming in again.
We'd love to talk about that anytime.
Yay. So real quick to remind people, you had been vegetarian for about 9 or 10 years before you went vegan. And in 2014, you had various issues. You had high blood pressure. I know you had eczema severely, and you had high cholesterol, and you were fatigued all the time.
Yes, I didn't have hypertension. I had high cholesterol, eczema. I was obese and I was fatigued. And the eczema was by far the worst of the several conditions we talked about. It's called pustular eczema. So pretty much you look like you have herpes all over your body or cold sores all over your body. These are pustules and they break open and liquid comes out of it. They're super itchy, whereas zoster or herpes or cold sores are not as itchy. They're painful, but they're not itchy. Eczema is particularly very itchy, where you just literally it affects your quality of life. You can't sleep without taking a bunch of antihistamines to quiet them down. You're constantly walking around scratching your skin. Sometimes I used to scratch so hard it used to bleed. It was terrible, and it was just the most debilitating condition. So I'm an ethical vegan. So I was a vegetarian, not knowing the dairy industry was more cruel to the animals than the meat industry, some people would argue. And maybe it's no coincidence we're friends. It's like,
I like my argument.
I love you for what you're doing. Switch for Good is one of my favorite corporations helping the animals and pretty much destroying the dairy industry, because if you look at the dairy sales, they've gone down precipitously, and I owe a lot of that to Switch for Good and what Dotsie has done and you guys have done. So going back to my story, I had this debilitating eczema not knowing that dairy was causing it. So because of the animals and learning about the dairy industry, I decided to make the switch and use plant-based milks if I wanted to drink milk, and eat plant-based cheeses if I wanted to have cheese. Literally just overnight, I stopped breastfeeding, as Dotsie would put it.
Oh, you stopped breastfeeding. Oh, that's hilarious. Okay,
is that what you say, Dotsie? Breastfeeding?
Well, it's true, right? I mean,
right.
It's like, but it's like, we know it is breastfeeding.
It's like, I'm not going to drink breast milk from a cow. It wasn't meant to be for me. And so I did it for moral reasons. And it was amazing because a week later, literally a few days later, I stopped itching. And I was like, wow, I had no idea this is going to happen. And then a week later, my eczema cleared. And it never came back until one day. I was in Big Bear and I was going to have coffee. And a friend of mine asked me if I wanted Baileys in my coffee. I was like, oh, how fun, sure. Not knowing there's Irish cream in there. And literally like 3 hours later, I started itching like crazy. I'm like, when did I have dairy? I mean, what is going on? And like found out that I like literally reviewed everything I had. And lo and behold, it was the dairy in my coffee. And I realized how terrible these allergies can be, where within a few hours you can start itching all over, or you could have sinus problems, or have a rash. It's quick. So anyway, it was confirmed to me that accidental dairy intake, how potent that stuff can be in basically causing your disease to come back. It's just, I've made it my life mission to educate my patients now. Now, of course, I'm not a dermatologist, but it turns out that there are so many people who are lactose intolerant, and that's right up my alley, right? As a gastroenterologist, I see patients with irritable bowel syndrome, labeled as irritable bowel syndrome, but they actually have lactose intolerance. A lot of the GIs don't emphasize on the fact that these people have to stop eating dairy because, there's reports that only about 30% of the people, mostly Northern European Caucasians, can tolerate dairy. The rest of us are lactose intolerant. About 65% of the population is lactose intolerant. Some populations close to 98% are lactose intolerant. So it's, as Dotsie would say, I'm sure you would agree with me, that dairy is racist. Why is it that we're putting recommendations, the USDA is putting out recommendations for people to consume a product which serves only 30% of Caucasian people? Doesn't make sense.
3 times a day.
30% of people
who
happen
to be Caucasian. Correct.
Right. And in the latest WIC questionnaire, only 30.
WIC is women,
right? It's a
children,
program for women and children, right? Low income. Only 34% of them identified as white, and that is a program that is fed by the dairy industry. And it's, so it's making most of them sick. In the Switch for Good recently released scientific report where we review 322 studies, you have a really strong voice in the report, which is my favorite part. All of your work in there. And in there you say, speaking about this, that lactose causes GI upset and fatigue and may lead to microbiome dysbiosis and irritable bowel syndrome, right? That's a big, heavy statement. Let's unpack that, each piece of those.
Mouth to anus, we have a tubular GI tract, gastrointestinal system, and it's involved in the digestion and absorption of nutrients. The gastrointestinal tract is not just one tortuous tube. It from mouth to anus, there are 100 trillion gut microorganisms that live in a symbiotic relationship with us. There are different, it's not just bacteria, there are viruses and other types of organisms. But the point is that it's not just one tube that's sterile. We have microorganisms that live with us and share with us many things. They can produce nutrients, they can produce vitamins, they can produce amino acids, they can produce serotonin, for example, neurotransmitters, they can produce hormones, and they can affect the GI tract locally and distally from head to toe because they're able to produce these molecules that traverse the gut lumen and circulate in the body from head to toe. So they're very important because they carry a lot of genetics, even more than our own cells. So that's what's new in the GI world right now, the focus on how to get these bacteria or fungi or viruses, these microorganisms to work for us, not against us, because it turns out that we have a lot of control over what kind of population of organisms are in abundance in our gut. There are healthy bacteria or health-promoting bacteria or viruses or organisms, and there are inflammatory microorganisms. And you kind of have a little bit of control over, and there's research going on about this, and there's more and more coming out. Well, how could you sort of control whether you're having, by eating a certain way, how could you control perhaps health rather than disease? And so that's where the research is now focused on.
All right, so we're going to unpack this GI upset, fatigue, because that's big for people, right? Like it's people need their afternoon coffee, and then they need their sleep medicine, and then they need their people aren't naturally getting rest, and so they're fatigued all the time, and then dysbiosis and irritable bowel syndrome, and this is all stimulating from lactose.
Correct. So there is a lactose sugar, which is a very large sugar molecule that needs the enzyme lactase that lives in the GI tract and breaks down the lactose sugar into the smaller subunits, right? Most of us are missing this lactase enzyme. So when we're
supposed to miss it, aren't we?
We're supposed to actually lose it after we stop breastfeeding after age 2. some people can hang on to this enzyme for longer, but for the most part, we end up losing it. And a lot of people, even if you're Caucasian, Northern European descent, if you ever have a gastrointestinal infection, usually you lose the ability to break down lactose sugar because somehow the lactase enzyme goes. I see a lot of lactose intolerance post gastrointestinal infections in many people. So if you have traveler's diarrhea, for example, I see a lot of people afterwards, they just can't eat dairy anymore, which is good for their health. They don't know that, but it's kind of a favor nature is giving them. But yeah, so lactose intolerance, what happens is this very large molecule is traveling in the intestines and feeding the enterococcus bacteria, which we'll talk about, some of the more harmful bacteria, and promotes the expansion of this harmful bacteria. But what happens, what people want to know, well, what happens to me if I have lactose intolerance and I'm consuming dairy? Well, you get severe bloating because basically you get all of this gas production in the GI tract, which is excessive. You get diarrhea through osmosis because this large molecule is dragging a bunch of water with it into the colon. You get cramping and abdominal pain because this whole thing is just irritating the gut. And so it's definitely unpleasant. I've seen people who would have such bad diarrhea where they would have 14 bowel movements if they had consumed any dairy products. I have patients who end up in the hospital. I had a patient who had a colonoscopy, a screening colonoscopy with me, and then afterwards, and she was dairy-free for the longest time because I had asked her, you need to stop drinking milk and stop eating dairy. She had a colonoscopy. She called and she's like, I'm deathly ill. After the colonoscopy, I thought she had an incidental perforation of the gut. I said, go to the ER now. We need a CT scan. We need to make sure you didn't perforate the bowel. So she rushed to the hospital. They did a CT scan and they're like, no, you're fine. I was like, are you sure there's no perforation? Yes, she's fine. And so then I was like, what did you eat after the colonoscopy? I went to Starbucks and had a latte. I was like, with dairy. She says, yes, I know. I'm sorry. I was just rewarding myself after the colonoscopy. I wanted to have something that I haven't had for a while. She ended up in the hospital. So a lot of people think, okay, so a little bit of gas and bloating and cramping, it can be bad and it's well underestimated. So anyway, so if there's one thing I want to tell you guys is that it's very common for people to get misdiagnosed as IBS because no one would think, oh, lactose intolerance could be that bad, but it would land you in the hospital. It can.
Are these all symptoms of inflammation? So your body fighting for a foreign molecule coming in this case, this large sugar molecule as lactose, and your body is mounting a defense in the form of diarrhea, constipation?
Such a good question. Such a good question. It's not inflammation at the beginning. When you first eat something that is not well digested, it will give you maldigestion. So it's sort of a maldigestion, right? It's not getting digested properly. However, there are new studies that show that it could actually, as a secondary cause, lead to inflammation. And I just read this paper today, actually, in patients with graft versus host. So these are people with leukemia and blood cancers, and you have to wipe out their entire bone marrow cells with the use of heavy-duty chemotherapeutic drugs, and then give them a transplant of healthy cells. These are donor transplanted. So graft versus host disease is when these grafted molecules basically and the body don't get along very well, and people actually get an overwhelming disease and die. So graft versus host disease is real. So they looked into...
Is it connected to the leukemia, or is it a result of the chemotherapy?
So that's the good question. They were trying to figure out, okay, so what could it be? So the chemotherapy wipes out our own blood cells, and then what you do is you give these other cells that are supposed to replenish what was lost through the chemotherapy
from somebody else.
And then you use medicines to make sure that these cells don't kill us. But some people get graft versus host disease and they die. And so the research is, how do we stop it? How do we prevent it?
So how do we get the body to accept the foreign healthy cells that you want to make the patient actually healthier?
Exactly.
Strong again, coming back from that cancer.
That's right. So there's a lot of research going on about that. And I actually stumbled upon this research article. Actually, Dotsie had sent it to me I was looking at this and it was so interesting. It has something to do with the gut microbiome. So it turns out that these graft versus host disease patients were dying. They have actually an expansion of a certain bacteria called the Enterococcus faecalis and Enterococcus faecium. And interestingly, these Enterococcus bacteria that live in the gut, which are inflammatory, they basically provoke the T lymphocyte cells, which are basically to protect us, but they're finding stuff foreign and just attack.
And the foreign stuff is, in this case, we don't want it to be attacked.
Exactly.
We want it to be absorbed and used.
Exactly. So what's causing the inflammation happens to be in this population of patients was found to be the Enterococcus bacteria living in our own gut, causing this inflammation, these T lymphocyte expansion and war, basically inflammation, right? It's the T lymphocytes are activated and they're just killing everything off. Then they looked at some dietary causes of Enterococcus expansion, and they noticed that, well, in fact, dairy had something to do with it, where for some reason these Enterococcus population loved lactose sugar, and they were expanded. This has been proven with in vitro studies and in vivo studies in mouse, and now they're proving it in human beings. So perhaps, and I don't mean to just jump into the massive conclusion, but perhaps until we know more, until they do randomized clinical trials, the hematologists and oncologists at the forefront of this disease, they need to say, get that dairy off the hospital bed tray, because obviously these people may even have lactose intolerance and suffer from GI problems. There were literally maybe causing the expansion of Enterococcus bacteria in their gut, which is deadly, could be deadly. But Enterococcus is also related to causing colitis, inflammation of the colon, lupus even, besides this graft versus host disease. And colitis is something that I deal with every day. And again, like I said, several things that have attribute to this. One is lactose sugar. The other one is proton pump inhibitors, the excessive use of them, and antibiotics. Proton pump inhibitors, like acid reflux medicines.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that medicines are all bad. However, they need to be used cautiously. Or antibiotics, you eradicate a certain amount of gut microbiome, and then the Enterococcus gets strong, because you guys, thanks to the dairy and the meat industry, we have a lot of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics.
Yep. And the reason is because those animals are being fed, the livestock are being fed antibiotics to make them get fat.
Yes.
And grow, and also because they're in such close quarters, they would get sick very quickly if they didn't have antibiotics.
Correct.
And that, unfortunately, is causing a lot of bacterial resistance in the world.
And then conversely,
and affecting us as we eat it.
Of course.
Not us, luckily, but humans, right?
But unfortunately, it also affects the vegans. We are not paying into that industry, and we're not consuming meat or dairy, but the CAFOs are doing a really good job producing a ton of antibiotic resistant bacteria and releasing into the nature, because all of this, for those of you who don't know what CAFOs are, these are concentrated animal feeding operations where they use a ton of antibiotics because they have these dairy cows and these cows in general, or animals in very close quarters, and in order to make sure that the infections don't go rampant, they feed a ton of antibiotics to these animals, and the runoff goes out into nature, into our environment.
And their manure, it goes out into the manure and into the environment, and then into the fields where that grow the vegetables that we eat.
Correct. And that's why we have, for example, this superbug called vancomycin resistant Enterococcus, this bad bug I was just talking about. It's vancomycin resistant. Vancomycin has been one of the biggest saviors in the hospitals, and now it's literally becoming a weak antibiotic.
And it's because it has so many bacteria that are resistant to it?
Correct.
That's so. What I'm hearing is that what we eat affects the gut microbiome. If you eat sugar, you will get bacteria that like to eat sugar. If you eat vegetables, you'll get bacteria that like to eat vegetables.
That's correct, yeah.
And so how many different bacteria do we have in us? And what are the ones that we don't want? And what are the ones that we want?
Right, there are...
Who wants to be fed veggies?
It's a good question. There are 100 trillion of them. But if you look at the trend, the colon has different species, and you could subcategorize it to different species of them. And there's more diversity in the colon. There's a little bit less diversity in the small bowel, so less phylum of bacteria, and a little bit less than the small intestine. You have the mouth and the esophagus and the stomach. So, but the most amount of diversity is in the colon part. For the most part, there are microorganisms that live there that basically produce health. And from what the studies show is that the butyrate producing ones or the short chain fatty acid producing ones tend to be the health promoting ones, whereas some of the other phylum of bacteria, for example Enterococcus, are causing disease through activating T cells. So what happens is when you eat badly, it promotes the expansion of unhealthy bacteria, which cause inflammation. Well, how does that happen? There's some animal studies that show that eating a ton of saturated fat found in meat and dairy mostly causes gut permeability. That means the tight junctions between the cells literally get severed. Then at the same time, you have all these unhealthy bacteria living in there that can traverse the gut. They can leave, these Enterococcus can actually leave the gut, go into the lymph nodes, and find their way into the rest of the body.
And through the bloodstream, right? They can get into the bloodstream.
That's right.
Because of this gut permeability.
That's right. And fatty liver disease is one of the diseases that I deal with, the liver, where there's a lot of accumulation of a lot of fat and inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And this Enterococcus bacteria there's a link between even the Enterococcus expansion and fatty liver disease. Here's an organ distant from the colon, yet you can control inflammation in the liver. Locally, you can have T cell activation where you can have inflammation in the colon and have colitis, such as ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. But what happens is you have to respect the barrier of the gut, where things that are in the gut need to stay in the gut, and they cannot traverse the gut lumen and freely find their way into the bloodstream or the lymph nodes. So what happens is when you eat an unhealthy diet, it affects the gut barrier, the tight junctions. Mainly saturated fat is one that's been studied. And then, of course, you can have expansion of these bad bacteria. So furthermore, it's like a vicious cycle. More permeability, more bacterial expansion, more inflammation. So that's where, a lot of doctors are coming out and saying, eat a lot of fiber, because we know based on studies that fiber-rich foods actually cause the expansion of the health-promoting bacteria rather than the inflammatory bacteria by producing something called short-chain fatty acids. And these short-chain fatty acids locally work on the gut lumen and fix these tight junctions that were severed, but also distally from head to toe have an effect. So diet does matter.
This kind of explains to me why you get cravings for what you eat. Tell me if this is right. If you eat a lot of saturated fat, then you start to crave fatty foods because your body is full of bacteria that's been fed by fatty foods, and it's screaming out, give me more fatty foods. And same with sugar. The sugar bacteria are fed by the sugar we eat, and then we have more cravings for it because our gut is so populated by that kind of bacteria instead of the bacteria that love carrots, the fiber in carrots and
That's
broccoli
right.
and such. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, there's such a brain-gut connection. We think with our thoughts, with our brain, but the gut is in constant communication with the brain. The gut is the second most innervated organ in the body. So after the brain and the spinal cord, the gut has the most amount of nerves. And so the brain, the spinal cord, and there is innervation all along the GI tract, and there's constant communication. So the gut is in some kind of a homeostasis, and it basically may be communicating with the brain and saying, oh, I'm used to this type of sugar, give me more, and there's stimulation of certain neurons and nerves and biochemicals that are being produced. Now if you cut that off, there's some kind of there's cravings, and people often say when they stop eating sugar, they can't stand it for a while. They keep craving it, and but after a while, perhaps through the repopulation of the gut microbiome, you stop craving those bad things because now you have a totally different gut microbiome, and that perhaps switches what's being produced as far as neurotransmitters and hormones which communicate with the brain, and your cravings change. But you're absolutely right. I believe that most of it has to do with the gut microbiome.
So I think this is just one of the most fascinating fields because we're learning so much so fast in this arena, and the fact that our gut can discern everything from our mood to our weight to our protecting our cells, even to having glowing skin. What is the most surprising bit that has come out in let's say the last couple of years about what the gut discerns in our body, and what was the most exciting part of that surprise?
My biggest wow factor was the fact that the gut is very important in actually affecting distal organs. I mean, who would have thought that the gut has something to do with cardiovascular disease and lupus and autoimmune diseases? I mean, 20 years ago, this was like a foreign topic. And recently, it's crazy that we used to not even know about the power of the gut microbiome and how important the gut microbiome is in relation with the gut, and the integrity of the gut lumen is very important. So I think the biggest wow factor is how important nutrition is in the diversity of the gut microbiome, and how important fiber is in promoting that health, and the effects of it in the rest of the body.
And how much fiber should we aim? I know everybody's different, so let's talk about the three of us. Should we aim for about 100 grams? Somebody that's brand new, that might give them a little bit of trouble up in the rumble. But
sometimes as they've done studies in Africa where they eat a predominantly plant-based diet, and they compared these children to children who live in St. Louis, where they would eat a predominantly Western diet.
Predominantly fast food diet.
Yeah,
that's the
food
part
diet.
of country I'm from, and that's a lot of drive-thrus there.
Which means what? A lot of saturated fat, right? And so what they saw is that there are a certain type of fiber breaking, some type of bacteria that break down fiber that are missing in the stool of the kids in St. Louis.
Because they never had to break down fiber. They don't really have to do that, so their body doesn't really
so there's expansion of the bacteria that you use most often, right? If you're eating a bunch of lactose sugar, you're going to have a lot of enterococcus. Now, if you're eating a ton of fiber, you're going to have bacteria that mainly break down that plant cellulose. So the westernized kids do not have that. So my theory is that this whole bloating occurs because when you suddenly start, wanting to go on this health journey, and then you suddenly start eating a ton of fiber, you're not giving your body the opportunity to colonize with these health-promoting bacteria that would be responsible for breaking down fiber. So whereas some people go over, whole food plant-based overnight, most people can't. So we really have to be realistic, because people do get excessive bloating and gas, and they get very uncomfortable. So I always say, start with, look, imagine, guys, most Americans get about 10 to 15 grams of fiber per day, which is like what you and I would get in our breakfast, which is very little, right? So I'd say, go from 10 to 20, and then 20 to 30, and just slowly crowd out the bad stuff, bring in more fiber foods and crowd out the bad stuff. And the more plant-based you get, the better it is, And of course, I tell my ethical vegans, go vegan. I mean, do it slow, but do it. And I tell my patients who don't want to be 100% plant-based, I say, be as plant-based as you possibly can, because you want to eat more fiber. It depends on how many calories you eat, to answer your question. If you're eating a couple of thousand calories, 100 grams of fiber is very achievable, easy. If you're eating 1,200 calories, it may be a little bit hard to get 100 grams. So I'd say about 30 to 100 grams is totally something that most people get who are plant-based. And that's
what about in
in
terms of Metamucil and those kind of things? If people just say, "Oh, well,
Fiber
I'll just add
one.
fiber, and then I'll have this chocolate shake on the side." How does that help the gut microbiome if you do it that way?
Yeah, so good question. Generally speaking, when I talk to my patients, when I say eat fiber, I mean food. Vitamin-rich, fiber-rich, nutrient-rich foods. However, when they've done studies and they would add Metamucil or some other fiber source, they have shown there's stool bulking, less diarrhea, less constipation, and it actually helps. And believe it or not, it's really hard for people sometimes who are severely constipated. Even people who are plant-based, sometimes they have such bad constipation that they actually need more help. I have a lot of vegan patients, obviously, and many of them have constipation. Not many of them. I'd say a few of them have really bad constipation.
The few that are come to you. I mean, you must see
Exactly.
more than that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
So you can't cure everything with food, obviously. I mean, that's where we have to use medications. And I can tell you that some of these patients need that extra fiber supplement in addition to their whole food plant-based diet to help them. And
Does it affect the microbiome? I had heard that those things don't affect the microbiome as much as when you get it in food.
They may, but what it doesn't affect is, for example, if you're eating food, you're also getting antioxidants and vitamins. So it may actually work in expansion of the healthy gut microbiome. However, it just you're not getting the other health benefits.
Yeah.
So in the last few years when we've been learning all this new information about our microbiome and how we can affect it and how we can feed it or not, and not feed the bad guys, because they're guys that are bad, not
Exactly.
girls.
Of course.
So many folks, I think it's just the human condition in general. If a little of something is good, then a lot of it's better. And so everybody seems to be kind of hopped up on lots of fermenting foods, fermenting, kefir and kombucha and sauerkraut. And what is your take on all of that? Do we load up on all these fermented foods, or we just have some of it? Or what's the deal there?
Such a good question. Up until recently, I was like, I'm not a supplement person at all, but I was giving my patients probiotic-rich foods and prescribing a bunch of probiotic-rich foods and asking them to take probiotics. Well, recently, studies have come out that shown that the probiotic pills may not be helpful. In fact, they may be harmful. Like this study came out of Israel where they took several populations. I'm just going to simplify it so it's less boring, but what they would do is they took people and eradicated their bacteria, the gut microbiome, by using strong broad spectrum antibiotics. Then what they did, one group got probiotics and the other group didn't. And they, among the four groups, these are the two they compared. Guess what? The group that got probiotics had a delayed re-inoculation of the bacteria. The group that the group
that just ate,
they just
naturally
ate.
Started repopulating
Faster. Correct. So
Okay.
the probiotic group actually didn't repopulate very well at all. So my theory, this is my theory only, I think that perhaps when you take 2-3 strains of bacteria and try to repopulate the gut, it's not a well-balanced ecosystem they're living in. So if you're trying to just take 3 strains and try to repopulate, it just doesn't work that way. So whether it's not well balanced, or perhaps these probiotics are competing with our resident probiotics, this is something that needs to be evaluated. But for now, I've stopped recommending probiotics to my patients unless they have all sorts of colitis.
Probiotic pills.
Probiotic pills. Then
Even the ones that say trillions of in each pill and different strains.
Even those.
Interesting.
Even those.
But all the fermented foods, the way I understand it, that's a form of a prebiotic. So how do we feel about prebiotics, and how do we feel about these fermented foods?
Well, prebiotics, basically prebiotic-rich foods are mostly fiber-rich, fiber, but fermented foods will also have a little bit of these probiotics. Okay. And I think that it's a little bit more natural to eat these fermented foods. The thing is, the science is missing, and I think most of us are pretty much talking out of our butts a little bit here, because it's the science is missing. Like if you look for scientific papers, it's non-existent. So
on fermented food.
On fermented foods,
okay.
Exactly. There's very limited data, and a lot of it is opinion. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. But I mean, are they harmful? I've never seen a study where probiotic-rich foods are harmful. But like you're eating sauerkraut, there's fiber in that, which is a prebiotic, and there is some organisms. But perhaps when you ferment something, there's more of a well-balanced bacteria, viruses, and other organisms compared to these pills, which is just like all these trillions of bacteria, not an ecosystem. You know what I mean? Because an ecosystem would have viruses too. Protozoa, it would have archaea, it would have bacteria, but also other ones. Maybe it's more natural than a probiotic, which is just bacteria. I don't know. We need more studies. But I mean, if you like probiotic-rich foods, consume them and enjoy. But I would say I wouldn't overdose on it just because I don't think that they have those crazy health benefits. What's important is the diversity of plants. How many different types of different colors of food, different fibers, different. What that does is it expands different types of organisms. So the more diverse your food is, the more diversity your gut microbiome has. In fact, I would challenge some of these vegans who eat like 3 things a day. It's better if you're eating non-vegan. If you're eating a ton of vegetables, you will have more diversity than if you're a vegan who's restricted to eating 3 things a day. Because there's a lot of restrictive people, restrict themselves, and that comes from the fact that some people have a little bit of bloating, a little bit of gas, and they're like, oh, I'm just not going to eat that anymore. So they keep eliminating and eliminating and eliminating, and then I get patients who are eating like 4 things.
So what they need to do is eat things that might disagree, but how do you adjust?
Blanch it. I mean, all of the cruciferous vegetables, you and Dahlia Marin have taught me that, right? And it helped my mom, right? Like if you're starting out, it's like raw broccoli is going to rip some stuff up, whereas all of us can probably eat like a whole head of broccoli raw, just with some salt and pepper. But blanch it, right? Get it.
And I usually ask my patients to push through a little bit of bloating and a little bit of discomfort. No one ever doesn't have any bloating. Everybody has a little bit. Some people have a little bit more accessibility, but I just like to challenge my gut, and I don't reduce my diversification very easily. And there's very little data on how to eliminate food safely. We know that there's this popularized FODMAP diet, which teaches people to stop eating fermentable fibers because they cause bloating. And we know that it's definitely a bad idea in the long term. We know that it could lower your diversity, and it could lower the population of the good, healthy bacteria in your gut. So, anytime you try to avoid fiber-rich foods, you're actually making your gut unhealthy. It's tough because some people have gas and bloating, and it's very difficult to discern what food exactly caused it. And so I have people blame beans all the time, but then, you ask them, what did you eat? They had a bean salad. Well, it could have been the tomatoes. But unfortunately, people tend to when they eat, they tend to pick one thing in that bowl and blame that. But one thing I can tell you is a lot of times you have to push through a little bit of bloating and gas and discomfort. You have to challenge your gut rather than just stop eating everything.
So get comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable sometimes as you challenge. And another thing that I've learned from you and Dahlia is that the beans themselves, it's such a great point that you bring up, is so many people lean into, just because they're popular, black beans or kidney beans, which are like the hardest beans. So get some navy beans, get some garbanzo beans, get some lentils, start there. Don't start with black.
And you can soak them and even double soak them, right? So the more you soak them, the easier they are. And then, of course, with beans, you'd cook them, but if you cook your vegetables, that makes them easier to digest. So that would be the first step instead of starting to eat salads all the time, raw salads. But
raw foods tend to be a little bit more difficult to digest. So start cooked.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
How fast does it take for the gut to change? I have a friend who says he's so sensitive to food that he gets depressed very quickly after eating a whole a whole bunch of foods. So how fast does
he gets depressed after eating foods?
Yeah, his mood changes. He is very much affected by foods and mood. And I'm wondering if the gut is affecting that, and how soon after you've eaten fast food, for example, and you've been clean, eating, really good, healthy food for a week, does your gut change?
Yes. I mean, there was one article that came out in Nature actually a couple of years ago that showed that your diet can change your gut microbiome within 24 to 48 hours. So there is a huge shift. There are other studies that are very interesting. If you take a bunch of people who eat meat, for example, and dairy, and you give them meat and dairy, you can measure how much inflammatory bacteria are getting produced, and perhaps all this inflammation can promote the depression. I mean, no one really knows. Perhaps it's the manipulation of the neurotransmitters that are being produced in the gut, like serotonin. Who knows? But we don't know exactly how that could happen in such a short period of time. There aren't studies to support that. But we know that, for example, if you take people who are regularly consuming meat and dairy and check their TMAO levels, which is an inflammatory molecule that gets produced by the bacteria living in the gut, their TMAO levels are, for example, say, let's just the arbitrary number, at 10 or 20.
When they're eating meat.
Yes. Then you take a bunch of plant-based eaters and you give them the same bad food, the TMAO levels are lower. The TMAO is a bad molecule, inflammatory molecule, causes coronary artery disease and vascular disease, right? So it's interesting because you're feeding all these bad bacteria regularly the bad foods that they want, and they're all ready to go make more TMAO, right? Yeah. But then you take a vegan who eats, or a plant-based person who don't have those bad bacteria sitting around waiting for milk and cheese, right? You give them the bad foods, you're not going to have as much TMAO production because you don't promote the unhealthy bacteria all the time. So perhaps your friend, and this is, again, I'm making this up because this is not evidence-based, but perhaps if within 24 hours or 48 hours of eating these bad foods, he's feeding the bad bacteria. And that can definitely change your the dynamics of your gut bacterial population. It can manipulate the neurotransmitter production in the gut. We know that the feel-good hormone, serotonin, is mainly made in the gut, which is super interesting because growing up and being in the medical field, I always thought serotonin was made in the brain. 90% of it is made in the gut. So go figure. Maybe he's that sensitive where he can feel it.
Right. How do we know if we have healthy gut microbiome? Like, are there tests that you do? If I was just wondering, I mean, I feel great, but maybe I could feel better.
I actually want to bring up a good point here because, we talk about the importance of gut microbiome so much and how important it is to eat fiber. But in the meanwhile, there are a lot of companies who've come out with these fancy tests and rip people off by saying, come test your microbiome. Look, the science is not there yet where you could individually collect stool from people. The clinical utility of these tests are very low. So in the meanwhile, there are a lot of practitioners who are not evidence-based, who are testing people's gut microbiomes and making clinical decisions based on it. We're not there yet. We can't do that. And so I warn people, if you're going to a doctor who is not evidence-based and you're paying hundreds of dollars for supplements to improve your gut microbiome, or you're paying hundreds of dollars to test your gut microbiome, you have to be careful. There are companies where you can submit your stool and they look at the population, and people actually make clinical decision making out of that.
Can they actually, but we are at the point where we can see the populations and discern one enterococcus between the, is it Bacteroides and
Bacteroides, right.
And or the Firmicutes.
I love that.
They can.
That was pretty good.
I learned that from you last time. I think. That they can tell between them by those.
So in populational studies right now in clinical trials, you could take stool sample from, for example, 100 people from this side and 100 people from the other side. Like feed these people carrots and broccoli, feed these other people bacon and cheese, and compare their microbiome. But the science is not there where we could take individual patients in the clinic and test their stool samples and make clinical decisions. It's not standardized. Why? Because we don't have standardized labs testing these stool cultures. We don't have standardized methods. We don't even know what's shed in the stool is the same thing that lives in the gut. Lumen. Perhaps what's being shed constantly doesn't really represent the resident biome living on top of the mucosa. So, with all this knowledge coming out, we have to be careful. This is research right now. This is at its infancy. All we do know is eat a lot of fiber because that is well demonstrated. Don't consume a ton of saturated fat. And so that's why a lot of the GI doctors coming out and saying, eat a whole food plant-based diet. Why? Because naturally, a whole food plant-based diet is devoid of a ton of saturated fat, right? Standard American diet is the exact opposite. And then you could be anywhere in the middle.
And of course, the plant-based diet, if it's whole food, has much more fiber.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can have a ton of, for example, you could eat vegan and have a ton of saturated fat in the form of coconut oil, right? Do I eat coconut oil? Yeah, sometimes. But, I want to make sure that all my patients know that 90% of what I eat is healthy, and then I'll have the occasional cheats.
Yeah. Eat your greens and beans, folks.
That's right.
I want to turn, if we could, directly away from the gut for a minute and talk about a really important subject, which is anemia. And before COVID, you and I were on a plane together in mid-February coming back from San Francisco speaking, and you had gotten a lot of questions about anemia and low iron and what that's from and why. And so you created a cheat sheet for me to understand anemia and the three types of anemia that there are, which are microcytic, which is a smaller red blood cell, normocytic, which is a normal red blood cell, and then macrocytic, which is obviously large. And underneath these three types of anemias, there is a host of potential issues that could be basically hidden, right? That surface level, it shows that you have anemia and you might have low iron. So a naturopath or something might be, giving you iron infusions. But it's really, you taught me, quite dangerous to not look deeper.
Correct.
So can you explain these three kinds? And if you need a cheat sheet, here's your cheat
thank
sheet
you.
from February.
I honestly, I love you for asking this question because I did have a patient who was vegan for 13 years, right? Who was in her 30s, who came to me and had metastatic end-stage colon cancer. And this patient had anemia, and her practitioner was infusing iron in her without asking the question of why is she anemic, right? So just because you're anemic, it doesn't mean you're iron deficient. And if you're iron deficient, it doesn't mean that you're healthy and you should just eat more iron. So it's very complicated, but like you said, anemia, and so this patient had a really bad outcome because the practitioner didn't ask the question of why. Yeah. So why is the problem with anemia?
Why are you anemic in the first place?
Correct.
They just said, anemia means lack of iron, so we'll just give iron.
Exactly, right? So it's Band-Aid therapy, right? It's like saying, I have chest pain. Someone dying, I can't breathe, I have chest pain, and you saying, let me give you some Tylenol. Well, the dude could be having a heart attack, find out why. So in the world of medicine, what medical doctors usually do is whereas it's so important for patients to have pain control or symptom control, for doctors, it's a step beyond. For us, it's why, right? That's the most important question. And then, of course, secondary, let's help you. So this person was getting a bunch of iron infusions because she was leaking blood from her colon because she had colon cancer. And the practitioner, the practitioner was not an MD, was not asking the question of why. So it was just infusing iron. This patient had a very poor outcome, metastatic disease. She had a genetic form of cancer, vegan for 13 years, but she had genetics for colon cancer.
So are you saying that that colon cancer, one of the signs of colon cancer could be anemia? And so
iron deficiency anemia.
Microcytic anemia.
Microcytic, correct. So there's microcytic, normocytic, and macrocytic anemia. Microcytic anemia is bad. When you have iron deficiency, it's bad. And why is it such a common question for women? Well, women, there's a couple of ways you lose iron. You're iron deficient. Periods. If you lose iron through the red blood cells, through the GI tract, or from the vaginal tract, that's how you lose iron. All the other types of anemias, you don't really lose the iron. It just stays in the system and recirculates and goes to the bone marrow. But if you're having heavy cycles and you have colon cancer, where you're bleeding every day or every month, you're going to lose the blood cells, but also the iron. So you become iron deficient. Right. There's another way you become iron deficient, that's celiac disease. But okay.
And I was going to say, and really important to know there that you taught me is if you're, let's say you're over 50 and you're not having a cycle anymore, yes. So you're not bleeding vaginally and you have microcytic anemia, that's a strong case for you got to get a colonoscopy.
Colon cancer until proven otherwise. Exactly. That's colon cancer until proven out. Over 50, anemia is bad. Under 50, menstruating, you could blame it on the periods. So I take a detailed history. How much do you bleed? How often do you have periods? You know, there are a lot of people with endometriosis. They bleed all. So anyway, so iron deficiency anemia, microcytic anemia. If you're bleeding heavy, we'll stop the bleeding. If you're young, don't eat meat. You know, what's that going to do? You know, instead of taking supplements, what you need to do is eat plant-based because it is the healthier version, you know, less saturated fat, less, like, for example, these same GI doctors who are recommending people to eat meat, they are totally discounting the fact that this could cause colon cancer. So let's fix your anemia and give you colon cancer later on. This doesn't make sense.
But go get a colonoscopy.
Right. I mean, no, I'm talking about youngsters with heavy periods, right? They go to the doctor, they're anemic, and they're told to eat meat. Right. And it's like, what, you're going to prescribe colon cancer to them in the older age because you want to fix their anemia, stop their bleeding. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, gotcha.
That's where it just bothers me because they recommend a bad diet for a disease that could be reversible, meaning heavy dysfunctional bleeding, right? Do you see what I mean? It doesn't make sense.
You totally make sense. And I also see that if you are vegan and you have low iron, doctors will immediately go to your diet because when you're a vegan, it's all, if anything goes wrong, that's the only time people care about your diet is when you're vegan. And it causes all the problems, they think. If you have a standard American diet, then they don't attribute your diet to your problems, which is you know, an issue. So it's important for everybody.
Just carnism at play in its greatest form right there.
Yes.
Like just say. So then real quick, normocytic and macrocytic, the
right.
underlying, because I want everyone to, this helps so much, and I've helped so many people just say, you know, go to the doctor for XYZ. So normocytic, what could be some underlying issues?
You have that, we talked about the microcytic, which is iron deficiency mostly, and then you have normocytic anemia. Normocytic meaning the mean corpuscular volume of your red cells are normal. They're not too small or they're not too big. It's not microcytic, it's not macrocytic, it's normocytic. And this is usually due to anemia of chronic disease, you know, maybe hypertension, dyslipidemia, cancer, or some other form of chronic disease can cause normocytic anemia. And that's not iron deficient. So many vegans will go to the doctors and the doctor would see anemia. It's not iron deficiency at all. It's normocytic. And they'd be like, oh, you can't be on a vegan diet because you have anemia. Although this anemia has nothing to do with iron deficiency, and you should go take iron, which doesn't help the problem. So you see what I mean?
And they need to be asking more questions because this is some scary stuff, and some of it is fixable.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. A lot of these chronic metabolic diseases can be fixed, you know, by improving your diet, or condition like diabetes, for example, type 2 diabetes could be reversible. And then, of course, you have the macrocytic anemia, which could be B12 deficiency, vitamin deficiency, or some sort of bone cancers. So when you have anemia, it means your hemoglobin and hematocrit are low. And they could be categorized in 3 main groups. And instead of throwing iron infusions at it, you have to ask questions as to what happened, why, and then you can fix it. but you have to figure out what the etiology is in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, this
So
brings us to
helpful.
a really important note, is that you are opening up a center for plant-based medicine where people all over the country can benefit from your knowledge and the doctors whom you bring in. Can you talk about it before we go?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you for bringing that up. It's called Institute of Plant-Based Medicine. Over the years, I've realized that a lot of people are selling veganism as snake oil, and that should not be. We cannot, or like, for example, because of COVID, there are a lot of people saying, if you just drink juice, you're going to be fine. Look, we have to be intelligent in our choices in life. Just because fruits and vegetables are good for you, it doesn't mean that they can eradicate disease, reverse all disease, and you're going to live happily ever after and have no problems whatsoever. So my thought was, why don't we have a legit center with board-certified medical doctors, DOs and MDs, and registered dietitians who are licensed and studied the evidence, the traditional evidence-based medical field, and they've studied it and they've mastered it, but they're also conscious of nutrition and how nutrition can help in conjunction with the medical therapy. For example, there are people who would have cancers, deadly cancers, and they go to a health coach who would say, hey, just don't get chemotherapy. We can't be stupid about it. We have to stay evidence-based, and we have to stay true to the science. We can't make stuff up. So I want IOPBM and our team of doctors and dietitians, we want to make sure that we're the place to go to get evidence-based recommendations. All science. It's not what I made up or Dr. such and such made up. It's all science, but also integrated with lifestyle. And that's our goal. So what we're doing is and then we recognize how hard it is to find a plant-based practitioner. So we decided to have remote access to our practitioners, doctors and dietitians. And we have a multi-specialty team where you can have a PCOS specialist, you can have a cardiologist, you have a gastroenterologist, IBD specialist. So we have
family practice,
rheumatologist, and growing. And so we're just bringing on all these really awesome doctors who are ethical, and most of them are vegan, one or two are mostly plant-based, but we're all ethical environmentalists, and we're also evidence-based, which in my opinion is the combination that people should seek when they're looking for a practitioner.
So no matter wherever you are in the world,
yes.
I would think you can, because of now we're using the virtual technology to contact doctors. So
correct.
Fantastic.
And how do we, I know how to find it because I've been there, but how do people find it out in the world?
www.iopbm.com, Institute of Plant-Based Medicine.com.
Easy peasy. And you are also on Instagram always sharing evidence-based.
Yes. I'm Angie.Sadeghi is my Instagram, and Institute of Plant-Based Medicine now has an Instagram too.
Awesome.
Where we're going to share a lot of evidence-based nutrition. We actually have a PhD, Dr. Kevin Klatt, he's a PhD in medicine, who's the director of the department, and he's helping us because here's the thing, there's a lot of nutrition advice out there that's actually not supported by research. So we want to make sure we have, I'm not a dietitian, right? So I have him as our guru of dietetics to make sure every nutrition advice that we give people is supported by randomized controlled trials or other robust studies.
Excellent. Wow. Thank you so
best
much
stuff. So glad we had
coming
you on again.
Yeah. Thank you so
beautiful,
much.
amazing, wonderful ladies. I love you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next time.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.